Thanks, Bruce. I'll get you back later. It's not going to go unnoticed. Good morning. I am Alex Russell. I am a software engineer on the web platform team at Google, and my job is to try to make the web a better platform for applications. For the last 10 years or so, that's kind of been my professional mission in life. And I've pursued a bunch of different ways of getting there, as Bruce mentioned, service workers and trying to pull up the trailing edge with Chrome Frame, and a whole bunch of other things like web components and desktop PWAs and now Project Fugu. I'm going to talk today about something that I've been talking about for a while. And so if these slides look familiar, and if you've heard this talk before, that's because I can't stop giving it. And so I'd like to make a personal plea, because I would like for you to help me never give this talk again. I want to be talking about desktop PWAs. We argued hard for this. We got the funding to do it. My team launched this all this year. Now, across Mac, Windows, Linux, and Chrome OS, you can take a progressive web app and install it and have it run in a standalone mode. This is the same thing to your operating system as installing an app. This was an extraordinarily heavy lift. Technically, it was very difficult to do, but we got it done. And now, desktop PWAs are available in Chrome. They've been available for some time in Samsung DeX and on Windows 10, but now we're bringing this to every other operating system too. So this is an extraordinary expansion of your reach. You don't have to go build an Electron app. You don't have to get users to download a separate bundle for your thing. You can just have them install it. But I can't talk to you today about that. And I can't talk to you today about trusted web activities. This is a technology that lets you take your PWA, like Oyo did, the third largest hotel chain in the world right now. And what you're seeing here is, this is the Play Store, and Oyo Lite is just their PWA. You're able to just take it, wrap it in a very tiny shell. Some of this is going to be automated soon, and you'll have to do it specifically yourself, but now you can list your PWA in the place where people are looking to install your application, not just from the browser. But I can't talk to you about that today. I can't tell you about the details of it as much as I very much want to. And in fact, I can't tell you about my day job either, because when I do what I do at Google, I'm mostly designing new APIs for the web, and we're working with my team to do that. And right now, we're on track to deliver, I think, probably the largest new package of powerful APIs that the web has seen in a very long time. 2 weeks ago, in Tokyo, we had nearly 45 people from Google, Microsoft, Intel, and other folks who are all working on the same project to expand the set of capabilities that the web can do. It's named Fugu because if we do this poorly, we're probably going to die in the same way that if you cut the fish wrong, you might have a bad time. So we're spending a ton of time on privacy, security, UX, and research, trying to make sure that when we make the web significantly more powerful, it stays safe. And we're working on a ton of stuff, but I can't tell you about SMS OTP retrieval, and I can't tell you about making login better, and I can't tell you about the native file system API, and I can't tell you today about, raw clipboard API, which is going to make professional applications that much more high fidelity, or better low-level audio and access to codecs, or better low-level access to the network, or access to HID and serial devices at high performance. I can't tell you about any of those APIs today. We can't get to it because we're kind of blocked. If you are curious about Fugu, which is what I spend most of my time on, you can go to these links and you can check it out. It's a big backlog. You can participate. If you are a Chromium contributor, we'd love to welcome you to the project. It's a growing effort. It's going fast. It's going well. We've got a ton of APIs in origin trials right now. The contact picker API is going out. What else? The SMS OTP retrieval API is just going out to origin trial right now as well. And we've got a few others that have just launched, like WebShare Target v2, which lets you make a PWA that can accept images and other media as a target once it's installed for sharing. And we're working on all of that, plus a whole lot more, and we can't talk about it today. You can file your own issues. You can help get involved. You can tell us what you need to make sure that the web is as capable and as powerful as you need it to be to handle your applications, both on mobile and on desktop, because we're working on both. And why would we do all of this? Why would we start to work on making the web a significantly more powerful platform? Well, it's not because it's a good time. I'll tell you pretty bluntly that if I was going to try to go add APIs to any other platform in the world, if I worked on the Android team or if I worked on, I don't know, the Windows framework team, I wouldn't have to go through the standards process. I could just go add the APIs that I want to add. I could write a one-page document. I could get internal design review. I could get privacy and security review, and then just launch it. And it would be done. And that would be great. But instead, as Chrome's standards TL, I make my team wade through a very tall pile of mud in order to get any of these APIs launched. We have to make sure that everything has a good specification behind it, that it comes with web platform tests, that we do the work in the open, that we try to ensure that we get interoperability, because that's the goal, because that is what makes the web special. The web isn't owned by any one company. Yes, Google is currently investing by a great deal, the most. And yes, we very much wish that our competitors would join us in that level of investment. But the web is worth this investment because it's unique. And if we lose it, we're not going to get it back again. We live in an era today of expansive claims about who can build what and where, and who can deploy it on which platforms, and through which stores. And the web is unique in that it is a platform that has decided not to give up its openness in order to get safety, that has decided not to put gatekeepers in control in order to figure out who can make what and share it with whom. And so what is the web, actually? Because this is a point that's very contended. I like Dieter Bohn's definition here, where he calls it linkable and agnostic to the client. And I think this is about right. Before that article came out, I started floating this definition internally when product managers or engineering managers would come to me and say, what about web views? Or what about Android instant apps? Aren't those part of the web? They've got links, you can link to them. Or deep links into Android apps, aren't those also kind of web apps? And I think the answer was no. Because the important part about the web is that you can share the awesomeness that you're experiencing with your friends and family, or anyone else who can see it, and you can share it with them with a link, and it doesn't matter what device or operating system they're on. That interoperability that we spend so much time, effort, and money on, that I would, given my druthers, prefer not to see my colleagues have to wade through in order to get, that interoperability is what makes the web special and unique. And so we do this work because the web is an asset that is something we're only going to get once. We could imagine other computing platforms that have these same properties, that are open, that are interoperable, that end up having exactly the same ability to share and link and work cross-platform, but there aren't any others. So this is the one we've got, and so this is the one that I'm working on. And so I think it's worth talking about how we got the web in the first place. So we got the first browser, circa 1990, the first commercial browsers. And at that time, we had been seeing a doubling in computing power roughly every 18 months or so, maybe a little bit less depending on where you were in the curve. By the time the iPhone was released, we'd had another 15 years of that same trend playing out. Desktop CPUs had been getting phenomenally powerful over and over and over and over again. And so the way we built browsers in the 90s and early 2000s was to lean into that single core, to make sure that we could take better advantage of that. And so it wasn't a problem that our primary scripting language was single core, or that our layout and rendering engines were single-threaded. That didn't turn into a major issue. And by the time desktop Chrome came around, we'd experienced 25 years of this incredibly, earth-shatteringly beautiful trend of more CPU power and more bandwidth at the network, making it possible to soak up everything that we threw at the web, making it inevitably an application platform. You can't start with 100 times less CPU and then give someone 100 times more CPU and then tell them that they've got a general purpose scripting language, but they can't make applications on it because they're going to find a way. And for the decade before I joined Google, I was one of those people making mistakes, finding that way, trying to build JavaScript-driven applications and the libraries that supported them. But then something happened when we got to mobile. In the mobile era, that single-core performance stopped going up in the same trend line. We kept getting more transistors, so Moore's law, in theory, was continuing to be correct, but we stopped getting a huge improvement in single-core performance because, well, more transistors, you got to split them up somehow, and the lengths of those dies, the lengths of those wires across the chip were starting to work against us. We actually sort of couldn't keep just making faster and faster chips, necessarily. Die shrinks weren't coming as frequently, which meant that the easy way to get more performance, in theory at least, was to give you more cores. And so that's what we got. So about the time that we started launching the modern era of browsers on the desktop, the game started to change, and we just weren't ready for it. Because for the 25 years before that, and the 20 years of the web before that, we had been building to a single core, single-threaded model. And we were not ready to adapt. Now, that didn't stop us in the desktop era from moving to a place where we had significantly improved computing power to make applications like Gmail possible. And these things changed the lives of users and developers. As a developer, you didn't have to manage multiple versions of client software. As a user, you didn't have to think about installing those versions of client software. You just got the freshest version all the time. Nothing to manage, nothing to mediate. When I was a kid, I remember installing Microsoft Streets and Trips off of a bunch of CDs so that I could plan a route. I don't do that anymore, and I'm grateful for it. This is a significantly superior model for deploying and using software, and the web made that possible safely without having to go through a mediator to get there. As soon as the web is capable enough to handle any workload, it kind of slides down that path, and as long as the web is useful enough for users, as long as it's a place where users are looking for those experiences, that marriage of very low friction distribution, easy sharing, and an incredibly powerful platform with broad reach causes those applications to move to the web. It's been so successful on desktop that our friends at Intel recently shared that more than half of all CPU cycles on desktop are currently spent running Chromium. Now, that could be because we have made a very inefficient browser. I'd like to think that's not it. But no matter how you slice it, this is at least an indicator of some success of the web platform. And at the same time, the web is less meaningful than it's ever been before in the lives of users because the desktop is less meaningful than the lives of users, and we haven't kept up. The web is not the center of people's attention and lives on their mobile devices, and their mobile devices are increasingly where it's at. This slide from 2016, I think, from Ben Evans, predicted where things were going to go. The mobile S-curve was going to overtake everything that had ever happened on desktop, and that has played out exactly as it was predicted. Today, there are more mobile phones sold every year than desktop computers by a wide margin. Most of those phones are not running iOS. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And so all of this has caused me to wonder, when are we going to get that moment on mobile that we did on desktop? Now remember, desktop didn't start with the web either. Desktop didn't begin life as a web-based application platform. We didn't start doing all of our collaboration and documents on the web. We did that with Microsoft Word. We didn't start doing all of our spreadsheets on the web. We did that with Excel. We started to use native applications almost exclusively, and the web was for pure information use. And then that changed. So when is that going to change for the mobile web too? When are we going to get our glut of CPU and bandwidth that's going to make it possible to do this? Because today, there kind of isn't a mobile web, and I want to talk about that for a little bit. Back in 2014, this was the situation we were looking at. We thought that something like 14% of mobile web, of time spent on mobile devices was spent on the mobile web. Fast forward to last year, and in the US, at least, ComScore was reporting a very similar number, about 13%. Now, 13% is not winning. It's not 50%. It's not 40%. It's not 25%. But it is not winning. Now, these numbers could be wrong, right? Gathering this data is extraordinarily tricky. Very few people have access to Vantage Point, which would allow you to get it for lots of good reasons. And these numbers have remained relatively constant. But there's a risk. We have seen, maybe in your work in the JavaScript framework ecosystem, or in the browser world where I work these days, we see that products that get some trajectory, that get some momentum, and then come back, then start to slide back down to earth and sink below about 10%. Once they're below about 10%, it's really tough to pull up. That's almost never happened, at least in my experience. Getting a platform or a product to pull back up from a curve that's down below 10 is a doom loop, because what happens is people start writing you off. And if you're not part of the next evolution of their product or their service, if you're not the platform that they're going to bet on, and the trend is working against you, well, suddenly that becomes a self-reinforcing belief. So if we're above 10%, we got a shot, right? The mobile web could maybe continue an upward trend, and we could get there. We could pull it up. But below 10%, my personal thesis is that that's a very tall order. Now, I've got some questions. I'm going to ask for folks to raise their hands, so apologies in advance. How many of you carry an Android phone as your primary device? Okay, more than half. That's unique at a tech conference, at least in Europe. India, it's a different story. Okay, now, how many of you think that you spend more than half of your time on the mobile web? Okay, I've got like 2 people, and I was really fishing for it. How many of you think that it's below 10% now? Sort of globally. All right. What if I told you that it's actually less than half of that 13% number and falling worldwide? Okay. What now? This is a bad time, right? If this is what's actually happening, so we have pretty good telemetry data from inside of Google and inside of Chrome, and the trend lines that we're seeing suggest that the web is not on an upward trajectory, that we're not moving to a place where the mobile web is going to be the future of the future platform. Because again, remember that time spent is not going to desktop, where we're killing it, right? Let's remember, we're doing a great job on desktop. The web is where it's at. All of our tools, all of our techniques that have been honed over the last 20 years, they work fantastically there. CPUs continue to get fast. They stay fast. And I think it's worth thinking about this with a little bit of concern. This keeps me up at night, at least. And for the last year or so, as I've sort of had access to this perspective and this data, it's caused me to wonder what the heck is going on, right? When are we going to have this moment, right? I keep thinking the fastest phones keep getting so much faster. Right? We had that glut of CPU speed on the desktop, and that was enough to propel the web forward, no matter how inefficient it was, right? We look back on the web engines that we were deploying on 200 megahertz single-core computers with 256 megabytes of RAM, and we kind of laugh now. They were so inefficient. And as we made computers faster, we made the engines faster, and that made the web go that much faster too. The things that we've done in JavaScript, just the performance of the language alone, going from a purely interpreted language to something that, on average, is something like 50 to 100 times faster, depending on what you're doing, is a testament to the raw power of investment in engineering. And we did that all in the last decade. So when are we going to get that on mobile? And is it too late? Okay, now, if you're freaked out, and I think there's reason to be, you might be saying to yourself, but this desktop thing, this seems good, right? I can keep making websites on desktop. That's going to be a thing that I can keep doing. There's a pretty good career there, right? Desktop is big. It's not going anywhere. And you would be right. But until the web starts closing that gap in capabilities, we're going to find ourselves on the wrong end of that doom loop too. Because the web is easy to atomize. You see this today. You see web views being used heavily in mobile applications. We see Electron and other sort of non-web shells running around the web. And incidentally, those things, they don't mean to. It's not their goal. But what they do is they deprive us of that ability to link and share those experiences. Suddenly, that superpower, the URL, the ability to see what your compatriots are seeing just by tapping on a link or sharing it, turns into a liability. If you put your thing into a container that incidentally happens to make it available only on one operating system or 2, have we won? Are we in a better place if we're using web technology but we're not using the web? Is this the thing that is worth saving? And I'd argue no. I mean, maybe you like HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Compared to C++, where I spend a lot of my time, they're amazing. But if you were going to start over, they're not where you'd start. There's some lessons to learn. There's some things you could do. And we see this playing out right now in China. The mini apps phenomena inside of one of the world's largest markets takes some of the best parts of that, and then it throws out all the cruft. It gets rid of HTML as we know it. CSS, there's some of that. You know, the bits that worked, there's a lot that doesn't. Let's be honest. CSS has a lot to answer for. And so if you get a chance to start over, you would. And you wouldn't necessarily build these things in the service of an open and interoperable platform. Because again, remember, that's a rare thing. It happens, it's a many miracle situation to get to the place where that is the thing that takes off. It's much more likely, in every scenario, that a powerful entity sponsor a platform that's closed enough to favor their interests. And that's what we've got in every other environment on client-side computing today. So if we don't close this gap, if we don't make the web a competitor, I think we're in a tough spot. If we can't show that the web can be capable enough to meet the needs of developers where they are, if we can't help users actually get to the awesome things that they want without the friction of going through a store, if we can't demonstrate that value in the lives of people the way that Gmail and Google Maps did, we're not going to ever get it back, right? So we have to close that gap. And now, I don't want to freak you out too much. The good news, if there is any, is that legacy platforms never actually go away. They don't just evaporate overnight. They continue on. There may be more mainframes operating today on the planet than there were in the late 80s or 90s. That's a thing that can happen. Globally winning technologies that win stop becoming the way that new applications are built. They don't go away. They'll still be serviced. And the desktop web is so large that we're not going to just turn it off. That's not going to happen. Instead, we're going to put it into maintenance mode. There will be a series of maybe decreasing levels of investment. The cycles for iteration will get longer. We'll start to see fewer and fewer new grads choosing to build this way and new applications built this way. And eventually, we'll start to see mobile-first application frameworks come to the desktop and become the primary way that if you have to target the desktop, that you'll get there. Our best data suggests that, developers and businesses won't decide to build something 3 times indefinitely. The willingness to invest is about 1.4 to 1.7x on the baseline investment of building a service. So if you have to choose to build it 1.5 times, you're going to have something that gives you portability. And if the web isn't where you started, it's probably not where you're going to end up. So this is what's happening. Mobile and desktop web usage are diverging. Mobile and desktop usage are diverging, and the web is not a huge part of mobile's future as it looks today. So the desktop could be where we end, maybe. I think it's safe to say right now that the mobile web isn't an independent thing. It's just kind of a hangover from desktop. And if you, like me, care about the web as an object, if you think that it is an ecosystem worth preserving, if you think that it has values of software, freshness, safety, security, user agency, the ability to control what happens and have an agent that works on your behalf and not the behalf of the system or the person who sold you the device, then the web is a really important system to preserve. It is a way that we should continue to want to deploy software. Frankly, I do this work because I'm offended by the notion that computing could slide backwards on my watch. And I think we should all be worried about that. Okay, so why is this happening? What the heck is going on? What happened? What caused this situation to be, right? We're getting a lot more CPU, we think, from our phones every year, right? We buy a faster phone every year and it's faster. We have more memory. I don't know about you, but the memory in my phones has sort of doubled in the last 4 years. That's a kind of a good deal. And we think that networks are getting faster, or at least cheaper. I have a couple of leads. First, we need to look at store policies. If the web is continuing to compete, if we're continuing to expand its capabilities and it's got all these advantages and low friction and improved capabilities over time, shouldn't that be playing out in the marketplace? We also have some privilege bubbles and some performance hysteresis going on, and we should talk about those a little bit. And I think that we're living in the shadow of desktop a little bit too much. Every other platform that moved to mobile didn't do it taking its UI framework and its libraries with it. No one runs a Win32 application on their Windows phone, if you still have a Windows phone. Nobody runs a Java Swing application on their Android device. Nobody runs a universal bundle desktop Cocoa application on their iPhone. Everybody else took the chance to reset and really deal with the change in the limits and the change in the behavior that's inherent in mobile. We didn't do that. I think it's hurting us now. But also, remember that we've also shipped multiple search boxes on mobile OSs. One of the search boxes gets you answers, and one of them gets you experiences. And those experiences show up in your life as icon that gives you low-friction recall. And the web traditionally hasn't been part of that experiences discovery mechanism. Now, I don't want to single Apple out necessarily, but we have to talk about Apple. Because in most markets where I talk to a lot of our partners, the inability to put applications inside the Apple App Store means that no matter how much reach Android has, there's still a fear of missing out, because Apple says that if you just take your website and you put it inside their store, you can't do it. So they have a search engine for experiences that explicitly excludes web-delivered experiences. Okay, so if you're a decision maker, and remember, your propensity to buy an iPhone goes to 1 as your income reaches about $100,000 globally. This is a sort of a trend line that what we see has sort of sorted itself out over the last couple of, a decade, I guess. What that means is that the decision makers see the store, and they go to look for their brand in the store, and it can't be there. Okay, what's the cumulative effect of that policy? And what's the cumulative effect of this policy? Section 2.5.6 of the App Store Review Guidelines say that apps that browse the web must use the appropriate WebKit framework and WebKit JavaScript. That's code for, if you make a browser, you can't bring your engine with you. Okay, who had iPhones? Now keep your hand up if you knew that the Chrome that you may have installed on your iPhone is not real Chrome. Okay, we can't ship our engine. If you install Firefox, you don't get Gecko. If you install Brave for iOS, you don't get their version of Chromium. If you make an opinionated choice about your browser, you are deprived of your choice about the platform that comes with it. And that means that the long-term quality aspects of browsers have been divorced. The brands are there, but the guts are not. And what this means is that combined with Apple's low and, frankly, inexcusably low level of investment in the WebKit and Apple Safari teams, the cap has been set at what Safari can do. And that's not just the cap of what you would get in terms of CSS or JavaScript functionality. That extends to a lot of other places. To make a modern browser on iOS, in order to get the high-performance JavaScript engine that you're restricted to use, you can't bring your own, remember? In order to get that, you have to opt into a modern web view and build your application on top of their web view. And that means that you can't have service workers. That means you can't do push notifications because service workers depend on push notifications depend on service workers. You can't be registered as the system default browser. You can't add applications to the home screen. All these critical functions that make up the modern web that would allow us to really get to strong PWA support and keeping the pace with what's possible on mobile are not possible in the Apple ecosystem. And so this is, to quote one of America's worst presidents, this soft bigotry of low expectations. Our decision makers, the people who have the richest, best hardware, can't see what the web could be because it can't be good for them. Apple keeps us from making it so. Okay, so I think we can say pretty clearly that the web can't play to win where Apple sets the rules. And this has some pretty bad consequences. Now, back in 2016, this is where the internet usage was. This is where users were. Obviously, this is colored by, the density is not quite right, but you get the idea. Cartesian projection be damned. And new internet users are growing fastest in the darkest areas here, and that's been caught up in a couple of other places. So this suggests that if we want to save what the web ecosystem could be for mobile, maybe we can look to these growth markets. Because there's something interesting about these growth markets. Almost nobody in these growth markets makes $100,000 a year. So that is to say, at least in India and Indonesia, iOS is kind of not a thing. It just kind of doesn't, it was a thing for a little bit for a while when phone prices were high, but as the average selling price continues to fall, it stops being more of a thing. And so this is the shape of the opportunity. Now you can ignore China because it's a totally separate market with totally different dynamics, but those places with the dark red, this is where the web can make another stand. But we're not going to make another stand unless we really understand what we're talking about. So a couple of months ago, my colleague Surma and I put together a little chart here to talk about what it is to have the experience of running a piece of code on a high-end versus a low-end device. Now, remember back in 2011 at the bottom here, these things are all clumped very closely together. Now, Geekbench scores are a bit of a bad proxy. They're not actually like total system performance, but you get the idea. And this is borne out by lots of other metrics and data too. This is single core performance. Remember, the web historically is mostly single core bound. And so what we see is that that blue line continues high into the right. Apple has the world's best mobile chipset developers. They are killing it. They have made a long-term investment in superiority for their chips, and it's amazing. When people say that an iPhone can be as fast as a desktop, in some cases, yeah, it can be as fast as maybe a decent laptop if it's fully spun up. Now, there's lots of limits on that, power consumption, battery life, all of those. But we're in a tough spot on mobile, because if you look at that bottom line, that yellow line, that is the budget line. The same thing more or less holds for multi-core, except Android ecosystem SoC vendors decided that they were going to compete on multi-core performance instead. And so they kept the pace a little bit, but then Apple, as soon as they decided to care, pulled away there too. The performance at the high end isn't keeping up. They're about a year and a half behind. And at the mid-tier and low end, it's so much worse than that. At the bottom, that Nokia 2, that is the real story, because that's where the growth is. That is a $100 device, which is, I think, down to $85 US now. And that's a brand new phone with specs in it and a chipset and an SoC that is almost identical to the phone that you would have bought for $300 5 years ago. Same chip, new phone. You can still buy it. And it's being bought by the hundreds of millions. And so why are Apple chips so fast? Because Apple is throwing money at the problem. The things on this chart that say L3 ARB and L2, those huge pieces of this chip, those aren't execution cores. Those are caches. That's not having to go all the way out to main memory to do something. That's the ability to retire instructions that much faster. And Apple spends an extraordinary amount of money for each chip die on making that work and making it go faster. These are redonkulous numbers. 3 megabytes of L2 and 4 megabytes of L3? Holy cow. That is desktop class architecture. Because cache, that cache storage, equals millimeters squared of the die. And that equals money. And so cache is cache. Spelled slightly differently, but that's how to think about it. And so why does an iPhone cost so darn much? Because you're getting a lot more cache for your cache. So the Android ecosystem system on a chip performance is about, yeah, this is a reasonable approximation. It's a hot trash fire. And I say that as someone who carries an Android as his primary device and spends a lot of time there. But this is the ecosystem that 90% of new phones are sold into. This is where 80% of the world's users are, and that 80% will shrink. Now, you might be thinking, yes, maybe the networks will save us. Well, I got bad news here, too. Density and use cause the availability of frequency to go away. 5G is not going to be here in time to solve this problem. This is OpenSignal's data about the relative speeds of downloads in various geographies. Most of these places have 4G everywhere. The difference between the top, which is South Korea, and the median is more than 2x. The difference between India and the United States is 4x, right? And the difference between India, where most users are, and the best in class, South Korea or Japan, is something like 15x. So whatever your icon says at the upper right for whichever connection you've got may have almost no meaningful relationship to the experience that is delivered. 4G everywhere does not mean speed everywhere. And this matters because the trend for what we're doing as web developers seems to match a lot more that trend line for the top-end CPU performance than it does that bottom end, where the growth is. There aren't a lot of new people in the world who are buying iPhones, right? Over the last year, the fraction of new devices that are being sold have gone from 15 to 12 to 10% per quarter of devices. New smartphone shipments are on iOS. That's a shrinking fraction of the overall market. And the rest of that is Android. And that Android is slow. And most people don't have new phones. Looking away from the top 1,000 and looking at a much larger data set, closer to 4 million, we see at the median, we're still sending 370K of JavaScript over the wire. That's mostly compressed. After compression, 5 to 6x, we're talking megabytes. Megabytes of JavaScript on cores from 2014. That's what we're doing. These are emissions. The way to think about this is that this is our way of dealing with mobile. And we thought that responsive web design could save us. We thought that responsive web design would be the way forward. It would be the way that we could adapt our behavior to this. So if I open up Chrome DevTools today, this is actually very frustrating for me, because if I open up Chrome DevTools today, what I'll get is a UI that looks like it's emulating that mobile device, except nothing about it except the viewport is emulated. Nothing. Not the CPU, not the network. And so we throw our desktop tool chains and our desktop behaviors at this, and it seems to work fine. But it doesn't work. It didn't work. I think we can say now, with about 10 years of experience, that responsive web design did not save us. And so it's worth asking, what is the behavior that's causing the JavaScript-driven UI ecosystem of mobile to fail so badly? Because that's what's happening, right? We can just acknowledge that we have failed. We are not succeeding today. So performance is accessibility. It is the basic basis of accessibility. If I can't get to it, the rest of accessibility doesn't matter, right? If I can't get to the experience in the first place, right? If I can't experience it, if I can't actually get to the place where the pixels paint and become interactive by tapping on that link, the rest of it's a wash. And remember that we're at a disadvantage because the web, unlike other applications, is not segmented. I didn't go to an app store, download it, and then have it in its own silo. The experience of my site is next to your site, is next to the site next to it, and the one next to that. And performance hysteresis sets in. As soon as something gets slow, users stop doing a lot of it. And because the web is this uniform place where you can go from site to site to site, the speed of the site made by the person sitting next to you impacts your success. If their site is super slow, people are going to want to stop using the web, and that impacts you. Your own site performance may not be the thing that does this. Now, I can't show you all the traces that I stare into. I stare into the abyss a lot with partners and with developers, and I can't show them to you because I have a personal code which says that unless someone gives me permission, I'm not going to go and post their trace publicly. However, if I'm a taxpayer in a jurisdiction, I'm OK with that. I paid for this. Right. OK, so this is code.gov. And code.gov is a static website. And it's a static website that ships 431 kilobytes of JavaScript down the wire, which expands to almost 2 megabytes. Now, I want to show you what it feels like to have a device. The high end is on the left, and the low end is on the right. The left is done. These are on the same network, by the way, running out of the same data center, connecting to the same server. Static website. Static website. You see this in the trace. What's going on here is a badly configured Angular application. It's easy to fix, but they just don't have a reason to care. This isn't their problem, right? It's fast on their iPhone. Long sigh. So JavaScript is our CO2, and we're drowning in it. The web will not succeed. Whatever else happens about store policy, whatever else happens about capabilities, the web cannot succeed in the markets where we're actually allowed to play until we fix our emissions. So, is it too late? I think this is an important question. It could be, right? I think we could all acknowledge that it could just be too late. And I have to admit, my friend Surma helped construct a word for me to describe the way that I have behaved over the last decade mostly, which is to believe that if we added new features like web components to the platform, that people would take their heavyweight JavaScript toolkits, they would refactor them, and they would ship the lighter weight thing because now we put all that stuff in the platform and they could use it. And that is not fucking happening. Instead, we have people continuing to carry around very tall tool chains because they work for them, they believe, on desktop, and of course they don't see the deadweight loss. The fact that their users are not there on mobile and that they can't succeed on mobile, well, those are the poor users, right? Remember, everybody who's rich has an iPhone. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a situation where our own behavior is leading us to our extinction. If we want to know who cut down the last tree on Easter Island, it was us, motherfucker. We did that. We would do it again, given the evidence we're looking at. I apologize for the swearing, by the way. So is it too late? Well, I don't think it's too late. There's still a path, maybe. If we cut our emissions, if we get the browsers working for us, if we start to put limits on ourselves and enforce those limits, maybe, just maybe, we could make it so that the web worked well for people in the markets where it has a chance to really come back, where we could build that well of reserve of interest and enthusiasm in the mobile-first world, and we could maybe compete. I've been working on some prototypes, but the basic idea of this would be something. This is just engineer UI, by the way. Please don't put any stock in this. We're not going to ship this in Chrome necessarily. But the basic idea is if you opted into a mode with a header, maybe we would give you a green lock icon. And if you did a bad job, maybe we would turn it red. For a couple of years, I've been banging on about budgets. Maybe you could put yourself in a box. Maybe your CI could tell you that you've done a job that wasn't exactly what you wanted. Maybe if you understood your baseline configuration of user, you could say, well, I've got so many network connections, and my P90 or P95 user is on this sort of device and on this sort of network. I could come up with a baseline configuration and set a budget for myself. Now, we didn't have great tools for this when I wrote these sort of long-winded blog posts, but Web Page Test has done an extraordinary job of making it possible to access these sorts of configurations. And now, with Lighthouse and Katie Hempenius and her team's work with a thing called Light Wallet, there's an ability for you to write a very small JSON file in your Lighthouse configuration, which sets a budget for yourself. And when run through Lighthouse, will give you a report about how you did. You can now sort of automate through Lighthouse your compliance with your own policy. And this can help you and your team set those sorts of budgets. And the web can compete. We can do this. All those other things that we're working on that I can't talk to you about today, that I very much want to come back and tell you about as soon as we're through this performance crisis, are working. Just last week, Oyo, who I mentioned earlier, they took their PWA, they put it in the Play Store as a trusted web activity application, and from a business perspective, it's killing it. But they started with an experience that worked for their users in their market, that was fast enough, that threw out the desktop tool chain baggage, that reset their expectations and allowed them to really deliver on it. We can compete. We can make the web relevant on the lives of the dominant computing platform of this era, not just the last one. But I need your help to do it. So, help me help you. Help me never give this talk again. Set some budgets. Try some stuff out. Turn some stuff off. Reduce your JavaScript emissions because it's much later than you think it is. As well as we're doing on desktop, that won't last. And now is our chance to make sure that the mobile web is a thing that we'll leave to those behind us. Thanks.